here they all come. So I know you can't see them, and it's always a bit strange for you, this bit, isn't it, Marion? Because you can't see people streaming in. I can see the numbers going up by the second. We're up to 65. Hello, everyone.
Hi, everybody out there.
Hello.
Give it a minute for everyone to get in, because there's I think we're expecting over 400 people this evening, so it will take a minute for them all to get in and get sorted.
What's nice is that the numbers have gone up every time, which means people must be telling other people these are good interviews.
Yeah, certainly. I think
visualizing it something like a theatre. You know, in a theatre when everybody's kind of rushing in and getting in their seats, taking their coats off.
It's like, except everybody's in comfort in their own homes, which is so nice.
Yeah, yeah.
Nobody's had to go out into the freezing weather to get here.
No. And one of the joys of lockdown is when it started snowing the other day, I actually had the thought, do you know what? We don't have to cancel anything.
Yeah, that is definitely an advantage.
Yeah.
You must have had quite a lot.
Actually, no, we've not had nearly as much as we wanted.
Oh, really? There you go.
Yeah. My daughter.
Because we're more on the west, and I think it's mainly been down the east.
This one is the beast from the east, yes.
It is, yeah, of course, yeah. Of course. People are creeping in this evening. I don't know why everyone's creeping in this evening rather than roaring in. Doesn't normally take this long for everyone to get inside, but maybe people are having a slow evening. We'll give it another few minutes. Have you had much snow, Marion?
Well, you know, London hardly ever gets any, but so 3 days was very exciting for us.
Yeah.
I work in a room which has double doors opening up onto our tiny London garden. I mean, it's the size of the garden is about the size of this room, but it's a bit like being in a conservatory, you know, looking out in the garden and watching this quiet drifting snow for days on end up against the shrubs and so on. It was so beautiful, and I didn't have to go out into it either, which was very nice.
Yeah.
Oh, as Anna's saying, I don't know how you pronounce that. How you pronounce Arbroath? Arbroath.
Yeah.
She's saying Arbroath has 8 inches at least.
Ooh. Lucky.
6 inches in Canterbury. Blimey, I'm jealous.
Well, of course, it's the east. It's coming in there, yeah.
Well, of course, yeah. So we had a couple of inches, but nothing major.
My daughter and her family live on the side of a hillside in Yorkshire, and they moved in 2 years ago in February. And within a week before they'd moved, they had a lot of their stuff down in their old place, which they hadn't stopped renting while they moved into the new place, so they could move slowly. Within a few days of moving in, they were completely snowed in. You couldn't get up down the hill. So in the end, they were carrying stuff, trudging uphill, you know, couldn't get a vehicle up there, carrying plumbing equipment up to sort of, and they really had a baptism of fire, but they were so excited about their new place, they didn't mind.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to suggest that we go ahead, and if anyone else is joining, then they can just join as they come in. So I'm going to hand over to you, Marion, and I will disappear off your screen.
And you'll disable the chat function.
Yeah, I will disable the chat function in a moment. I'll give it a minute. Well, what I do now is that I disable it apart from people can speak to me, but they can't speak to anyone else. So if anyone has a problem, you can send me a direct message in the chat, but you can't speak to each other. So I will do that now.
Well, thank you, Natalie. Are we good to start? Oh, Natalie, we've got a picture of you there. You haven't quite disappeared. Never mind. Okay, so hello everybody. However many hundreds of you there are out there, it's lovely to be back and talking again to another really creative woman who's my guest this evening. So some of you who've been here on previous interviews will have heard Anna's name mentioned, Anna Dreda. who for many years ran a bookshop in a little town in Shropshire called Much Wenlock, and was the founder and organizer of an amazing Wenlock Poetry Festival for many years. And the reason you may have heard of her on these interviews is because two of our previous guests are poets and have contributed to Anna's Poetry Festival. And in fact, both of them say they owe her a great debt for having given them their chance at the Poetry Festival. And I owe Anna a great debt as well, because she invited me to take part in the festival, although I'm not a poet. So Anna, very much welcome.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
And perhaps you'd like to tell people how you and I first met.
Well, it was a lovely story, actually. A friend of mine, Angela, told me that she had a friend who was a writer, and please would I read her book. And, you know, I just hate it when people ask me to do that, because you never know what you're going to get, and then you have to make some sort of response. And I'm really glad to say that I adored your book, Marion. I couldn't put it down. I think I read it in maybe 2, at the most 3 sittings. I was completely caught up in it. And I said to Angela that I felt it would be completely fitting for you to come and talk to us at the Poetry Festival. But then what happened is that...
Hold on one moment, Anna. There'll be people out there who won't have read the book. So the book is Uncertain Light, until it's a novel. So perhaps you should mention why you thought it would fit in with the Poetry Festival.
Do you know, I don't remember the actual honest reason. I just knew that I wanted to meet you because you had written this wonderful book. And I'm sure, knowing me, that what I did was to make all sorts of very good and valid reasons.
Well, the book has a lot of Urdu poetry in it. So officially I was coming to talk about
I do beg your pardon. Yes, my head is full of adverbs and maths and geography and design and technology, because I've been homeschooling the grandchildren all day. I beg your pardon. In that case, I wouldn't have had to make any excuses whatsoever. And I was thrilled that we could have both of you here with us at the festival, Angela and you. But of course, what happened was that was the year when my mum was very, very poorly. It was the year she died. And although you did come to my shop, and I even heard you had a little snooze at the back of the shop, you and I didn't actually meet.
So this is our first actual meeting.
Yes.
And it's not even an actual one, but it's
No.
doing duty for an actual one. And one day we will really meet. But I spent a long weekend in Much Wenlock with hundreds of poetry events going on around me. It was the most amazing experience, and meeting loads of people and feeling everywhere the effect of your creativity in setting that up. So I'm deeply grateful.
Well, thank you.
So now we're going to go back to the beginning of Anna's creative life, which I'm sure started when she was a toddler, but we're going to start with adulthood. Tell us, you said when we were chatting before, and you said you'd always known you wanted to be a bookseller.
Yes.
How was that?
Well, it was before adulthood, actually. We do have to go back to me being 12 years old.
Okay.
And I read a book which many of you may have read. It was called The City of Bells by Elizabeth Goudge. And it's set, I don't know, 1860s, something like that. And a man comes back from the war, and he kind of falls into setting up a bookshop in the shadow of the cathedral in Wells, actually. And I was reading about this man and the rooms that he was setting up his bookshop in, and the books coming into the shop and being placed on the shelves. And it painted such a beautiful picture that I immediately knew that that was what I was going to do. I didn't know when I would do it. As I say, I was 12 years old. I just knew it was absolutely, I can remember the light bulb going off above my head. What was strange was that I ended up in, well, I say ended up because I worked for a brief time in another bookshop, but then for near enough 30 years in Wenlock Books. And not so many years ago, I was upstairs in my bookshop with my arms full of books, which was one of my favorite positions to be in, with an armful of books, ready to put a book on the shelves. And I suddenly realized that not only was I doing what I had always wanted to do, I'd always known that, but I was actually in the right building. And whenever I mean, you've been upstairs in my book, in that bookshop, Marion, and I mean, it's just got old timbers and an old wooden floor, and everything creaks and slopes and is slanted and crooked, and there's nooks and crannies, and surrounded by the old books. And I just thought, this is absolutely where I was always meant to be. And for that, I have eternal thanks.
It's very interesting because a couple of the other people that I've spoken to and interviewed on this series are women who've come in midlife, if you like, to a realization of where their talents lay and what they could do with them. And it's a really lovely story to start with this from childhood. I've read some Elizabeth Gooch, but I've not read that one, and I will now.
It's a lovely, lovely book.
And I'll let you in on a secret, a novel that I started before I wrote Uncertain Light and then abandoned, but it was kind of like the starting point, which led in the end to Uncertain Light, started in a bookshop. And a bookshop which I'd never seen Wenlock books at that point, but it was very like that. A beautiful old, is it an Elizabethan building? It feels like it. It's a very old building, isn't it?
It's 15th century.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, okay, well, that's lovely. So that's childhood. But a lot of things happened before you actually got into your bookshop, didn't they?
Indeed. I got married very, very young. I was 19 when I got married. I was 20 when I had my first child, 21 when I had my second child. And, you know, I kind of think, what was I doing? But the wonderful side of that is that now at mid-60s, I've got grandchildren who are 8, 9, and 2 of them are 10. So
and you're not too exhausted to enjoy them.
And I'm not too exhausted. I mean, friends my age are still waiting, whereas I actually never had time to wait. So, but yes, I could have gone to university. I could have done all sorts of things. But in fact, I got married, had children, and for 10 years was pretty happy, really, just being an at-home mum. Did lots of things, you know, from her. I was lucky in that I didn't have to go out to work, but also that had its own problems. And when my children turned 9 and 10, that was when I started working part-time in a little bookshop in the town I was living in at that time. And that was kind of, two things happened at the same time. I started working part-time in a bookshop, and I started dancing, and it was a form of dancing called circle dancing.
Yes.
And these two things came together and kind of reminded me of who it was I was actually supposed to be. And although, you know, for me, being a mum was always part of that, it wasn't being married. So, you know, went through quite a painful period over the next 5, 6, 7 years of trying to stay, but actually knowing that I had to go. Eventually getting my own place to live, going to university, which, you know, by this time I was 36, going to university to do my first degree. I went to Wolverhampton University. I loved every single minute of it. Got a first class degree with honours, went on to do an MPhil. And at the same time as I started my university career, a friend I had who had a little bookshop in Much Wenlock asked me if I would go and work for him 3 days a week, because he had just bought the building across the road and was going to turn it into Wenlock Books. His bookshop at the time I started working there was literally his front room. And so I worked 3 days a week for him. I did my university degree full time. So that's, you know, I've always been used to doing more than a full time's worth of work at one go.
And how old were your children at this point? They must have been almost grown up, in fact.
They were teenagers, late teens. Yeah.
Wow. Well, I mean, there is an advantage in starting your family young, as it does leave you energy for other things when they're grown up.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Was it, as a matter of interest, were you from a family that would have expected you to go to university?
Not really. I was expected to go because I always did so well at school, but I would have been the first one in our family to have gone to university.
Right.
Yeah.
And were your family pleased when you finally did, the parents?
They were. I think they had this sense of, at last I was finding out who I was supposed to be. You know, so although, I mean, I was very lucky in that my parents always accepted whatever I did, you know, so whether it's getting married young, going to university late, going to a bookshop, you know, whatever it was, I was always accepted. But my mum had always really wanted me to be contented. And all the while I was married, I knew that I wasn't contented.
Mm.
And when I got to university and started working in the bookshop, then I started to think, now I know what my mum was talking about.
Mm.
Because
And did that coincide with your leaving your marriage?
yeah, it did.
The bookshop.
It did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And your mum and dad were okay about that as well?
It was hard for them, very hard, but they were incredibly supportive. Yeah. And I must say, you know, I've stayed friends with my ex-husband and his wife and their children. In fact, their daughter, my ex-husband's daughter, Harriet, was a Saturday girl in my shop from when she was 14 years old.
Oh, nice.
We're very, very close. So, you know, things turn out the right way.
That's lucky, very, very lucky.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I'm sure you worked at it to make it lucky too.
Yeah.
So just coming back to the bookshop, you said when we were chatting before that you served a very long apprenticeship before you took over the shop yourself. How long was that?
It was a 14-year apprenticeship. I was very, very happy working for Perce, who was my friend who phoned me up and said, please, would you come and work for me? But I did always think, this will never be mine, because, you know, he wasn't that much older than me. He was only 9 years older than me. And I just didn't see it happening. So I just settled in and made the best of being in this beautiful shop. It was already a beautiful shop. For 3 days a week. I loved the customers. I loved the way Perce cared for his customers. I learned a lot from him about how to be in that shop. But he then had something happen in his life that was very devastating, and he had to sell up very, very quickly. And thanks to a dear friend of mine who just said, you need this bookshop, you've always needed this bookshop, and she put the money up so that I was then in a position to take over the shop. And to be honest, I still remember the first, I mean, I'd been working there for 14 years. The first time I turned the key in the lock of the door with it being my shop, I still remember the feeling in my heart when I did that. So yeah, it was a long apprenticeship, but it was a good one.
But then,
what was interesting,
but you also presumably, you know, you didn't have the total responsibility at the beginning. You could learn on the job without it being too anxious a financial responsibility for you, presumably. You know,
absolutely.
I've always imagined that running, you know, I once had a fantasy that I would do a bed and breakfast or a tea shop kind of thing, which is really bizarre because I'm not such a great cook. But I do enjoy cake a lot, and I enjoy the times when I do cook. I enjoy giving it to other people. So I had this fantasy that would be a lovely thing to do, and in my mind it was in a beautiful little building like the Wenlock Books. But the thing that always I knew I would never be able to handle was the financial anxiety, and presumably it was good to be able to learn the job without being financially responsible, in a way, for you.
It was, but I will admit that when I took over the bookshop, I actually never worried very much about the money side of it, the financial side of it.
Amazing.
Until sorry?
That's amazing to me.
I know. I mean, I never did a business plan. I never had a budget for anything. I always worked from my heart, always. And people would say to me, how's it going? And I would say, oh, it's going brilliantly. And that was nothing to do with the money. It was that I was having the time of my life. And I had the time of my life for a long time. It began to get anxious making with Amazon, the financial crash, all that sort of thing. Then it got harder. But my friend Tor, who was the one who'd put the money up in the first place, and I was talking to her one time, this is when, you know, everything was crashing and it was just awful. And I was talking about maybe reducing my stock and cutting back on things. And she said to me, Anna, why don't you just be as expansive and heartful as you have always been? And I did that, and that saw us through many years. You know, when everybody else was going to the wall, bookshops were closing left, right, and center. I kept going because I And I honestly think it's because I did put so much love into it.
Mm.
People came for the love
Mm.
and the books.
But it was that, you know, I was only there at one time for the festival, but it was the kind of bookshop which you felt you could chat to the person who was selling in a way where, you know, you could say just what you were interested in and they would know all the books. They would be able to show you. And it wasn't you, it was the people you trained who was doing this for me. But the love was very clear in the bookshop. It was a very personal bookshop. Yeah.
Absolutely. And thank you very much for saying that. But I would
It was
also
also
add
very
to that.
pretty. It was very pretty
Yeah.
inside, not just the building. You obviously
I know.
enjoyed making it pretty.
It was very beautiful, a very beautiful building. I was very lucky, yeah. But what I would also say is it wasn't just that customers could freely talk to me or my staff. They would talk to each other. And we had the most amazing, I used to say that little miracles happened almost every day. One time a customer came into the shop. Her son was in the army. He had just been called up to go to Iraq, I think it was. You know, many, many years ago now. And she had in mind a particular prayer or poem, I can't remember which it was, and she couldn't remember the book that this poem was, it was a poem, this poem was in, and she was trying to describe the poem to me. Somebody else in the bookshop said, I know the poem you mean, and he beetled off upstairs because he was a regular, and he found a poetry book that had that poem in it. And we gave her the book and she wrote it out, and he put that poem in his breast pocket and he came back safe. Things like that happened all the time. Less of an important story than that one. One time somebody came in and for some reason wanted to know something about a donkey sanctuary that she thought was nearby. And I said, I don't know anything about a donkey sanctuary nearby. Somebody else said, oh, you mean this one? I've just been there. It's wonderful. Here's how you get to it. You know, and those very weird moments of connectivity just happened all the time.
Well, I think I mean, that was the way the bookshop was run, but it was also helped by the fact that the rooms were small. So
yes,
you had to overhear conversations.
Yes,
you
absolutely.
couldn't get away from it. But there were several rooms. Yes, there were several rooms, and there was one corner where tea was being, you know, you could make yourself a cup of tea. I presume was that all the time? And it was certainly there in the poetry festival weekend. But did you always have that corner?
All the time, and there would often be homemade cake on the table. There was a beautiful round table on the first floor with chairs and cushions, and you know, the newspapers. You know, people could just come and feel comfortable. And actually, that round table came about because of another book. When I took over the bookshop, when it became mine, although I hadn't actually thought about it consciously, the first thing I knew was I needed to put a round table in that space upstairs. And we had a tower bookshelf there. And I said, please, would you take that out? I don't want it anymore. So you see, I'm immediately not worrying about the money because I'm getting rid of all this stock and replacing it with something that technically doesn't make me money. And for the first few years, at 4 o'clock, I used to have somebody come in after school, and I would go upstairs and we would make tea, and whoever was in the shop. And I got that from a book called The Education of Harriet Hatfield by May Sarton. And that's what she did in her bookshop. And as soon as the shop was mine, I kind of thought, that's what I want to do. So that set the tone, I think, you know, for what really mattered in the shop.
Well, in a way, you said that your predecessor, it was the front room of his house. And there was a sense when you were there that these were rooms in a house that was lived in and loved.
Yes.
It wasn't a house in a conventional sense, but they were rooms in a house, and you moved from one to the other.
Yes.
And Anna said that she had heard that I'd fallen asleep in her shop. Well, in self-defense, I need to tell you what that story is, which was another Wenlock book story. But basically, that festival was so intense. There were sessions going on in marquees in the churchyard garden. There were sessions in buildings all over the town. You would wander around the town and you'd find another little session here, another session there. And I was doing my session, but I was just wandering in a bit of a euphoria from one to the other and having these conversations with people everywhere. And at one point I realized that I was on in a couple of hours' time, doing something, and I was absolutely dog tired. So I went into the shop, and there was a young assistant there, and it was quite quiet in the shop at that moment because everybody was in sessions for Poetry Festival. And I said, I just need to have a little rest. And you know, I was staying in a hotel, but it didn't occur to me to go back to the hotel to lie down. I went to your shop and I said, do you think I could just sit in that armchair, which was in the tea making corner? And there's not too many people about it. So, right, if I just doze off and will you wake me in 10 minutes time? And she said, sure. So I did. It's, you know, which says a lot about your shop. I couldn't have done that in the Waterstones down the road. It's a lovely shop. But
No. And the young woman that you spoke to was Jasmine, who came to work for me through the school scheme whereby they send people out to get work experience. And so Jasmine first came to me when she was 14 years old. And she was a lovely young woman, but she did have mental health issues. And she became very, very poorly while she was working. She used to work for me on Saturdays. She became very, very poorly, ended up having 2 years off school. And I kept her job open because I wanted her to feel that she could come back. When she did come back, sometimes she would work for half an hour and then her face would go the colour of putty and she'd say, I have to go home. Some Saturdays she would phone up on the Saturday morning and say, Anna, I'm too tired to come to work. And I realised that I was the only person who could employ her, because who else would understand this girl who had been such a wonderful, bright bubble of energy would phone in and say, I'm too tired to come to work. So I knew I had to employ her and wanted to. So because she had to give up her A-levels, I invited her to come and do an apprenticeship with me. Now I actually paid her the proper wage, because an apprenticeship, I think you only pay about £2 an hour or something, but I didn't want to do that. So I paid her properly, but I got her onto the apprenticeship scheme because I wanted her to have something she could show for what she was doing. Jasmine now works for David Fickling Books in Oxford. They are the publishers who published Philip Pullman. She has made such a success of her life. And of all the wonderful things that I think the bookshop created or enabled, Jasmine is the most important thing I ever did.
It's wonderful. Wonderful. And she was lovely. When I was there, I met her briefly, but she was a lovely young woman. So what a lovely thing to have made that for her.
She was just gorgeous. Yeah, I adore her. And I'm so proud of her.
I'm sure.
Just another tiny, tiny Jasmine story. One year I persuaded her, this was years after she'd been so poorly, and I persuaded her that she was still working for me, that she should go to the Hay Literary Festival. I said, it's somewhere you just have to go. You can't carry on in the book selling world without having been to Hay. The very next year she was there as a publisher's assistant.
Oh, lovely. It's lovely.
Yeah.
You're going to crack up again.
Sorry?
I say, if we go on talking about Jasmine, you're going to crack up again.
I know.
I'm going to move you on to something else. So while you were doing the bookshop, in addition to all these lovely personal things that happened in it and that it became for people, you moved way beyond what normal booksellers do in encouraging people to read. So tell us about that.
Well, for me, it was about selling books. Of course, it was about selling books, but it was also about passing on my love of books to anybody who wanted to be part of that. And I love connecting people with each other through books. It's something that I just love. So I just very naturally set up lots and lots of different groups, often very organically. You know, ideas would come to me and we would just do it. So, for example, we had a poetry club for children where they used to come after school and we'd sit around the table and just read poetry to each other. We had reading groups. I think one time we were sitting around the table and somebody said, wouldn't it be lovely just to go on and on and on doing this? And so I created something called a reader's retreat, and we went to a farmhouse in Wales and we stayed there for the week and we read short stories and some people wrote, so, you know, we just used the time creatively, but it was time that gave people permission to read, to write, to do whatever it was creatively they wanted to do. Two of my customers moved to Venice from the West Midlands, as you do. And one time I just thought, wouldn't it be nice to have a readers retreat in Venice? So we started something called Readers Tours of Venice. I think we went about 7 times. So if ever an idea came up, I was just free to follow it if it was something I wanted to do.
And do you think that being in a small town was part of that? Do you think?
Yes, because most of the people who came on these things were locals, or they were people who had come to the town for a holiday because it was a very beautiful town. So people, it was somewhere visitors came. I mean, now that we're in Zoom time, COVID time, my reach is actually growing. But then the bookshop was the heart of the town, and the people who came into the bookshop made it what it was.
Yes, and also you got to know the people who came into the shop probably in a better way than if you'd been in a big city. So it had that community feel about it, and the kinds of things that happened there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
I know.
No, go on.
I was just going to say, I know you wanted to talk about the poetry festival as well.
Before we get to the poetry festival,
okay.
You did a literature degree, didn't you? And you studied women writers, women novelists, Black women writers, and so on. But but later on in your time in the bookshop, poetry became quite a dominant strand, didn't it?
It did.
Was that something that sort of just happened organically because you enjoy poetry and you found other people who do, or what was that about?
I used to love poetry at school, and then lost it along the way. But these readers' retreats that I started, they used to take place in a farmhouse in Wales. And the woman who hosted us was a woman called Carol Jacobs. She was a poet. And we decided that the readers' retreat, it would be very nice if we had guest poets to talk to us in the evenings when we'd had, all this lovely time together on our own in the day. And the first person who came as a guest poet was Gillian Clark, who lived just in the next valley from where we were. And Carol knew her.
What happened to Gillian that she came to prominence?
Well, Gillian was the national poet of Wales, and Carol knew her. And Gillian is such a gorgeous woman and such a feet on the ground woman, as well as being a very, very fine poet. And she came and read to us on one of the evenings. We had the most wonderful evening. Before she did her poetry reading, we were all sat around Carol's big farmhouse table, and Gillian and I got on like a house on fire, and I was telling her about the shop. And before I knew it, she was saying to me, you should have a poetry festival in Much Wenlock. I'm going to tell my friend Carol Ann Duffy, this is before Carol Ann was Poet Laureate. She said, I'm going to tell my friend Carol Ann to visit you. Now, I knew that Carol Ann was a very famous poet, and I knew some of her work. And I just thought, well, yeah, right. About 6 or 7 weeks later, I took a phone call in the shop, and it was Carol Ann saying, my friend Gillian said that I have to come to your bookshop and do a reading. Well, I knew that I couldn't host Carol Ann in my, as you've already said, pretty small bookshop. So we went to the local art centre. We had 200 people there. You could have heard a pin drop. It was incredible. And that was how the poetry festival started. Carol Ann said, you've got an audience here. You need to be putting on a festival. I said to her, if you will be our founding patron, I'll start a festival. And the very next year, I had my first grandchild, and the festival was born. The grandchild was born in February. The festival went on in March or April. It was a pretty intense time, because what I loved from what I learned that I loved about poetry was hearing it. I'd really stopped reading it. I'm a voracious reader, but I'm hungry for books. I'm hungry for story. But sitting and listening to somebody telling their poem, for me, is absolute magic. And that was what I wanted to do.
Do you think it depends on the poem? Because I've always liked to have a text in front of me, because you can take it slowly, you can go back over it, you can see things second time round. In Urdu poetry, they have this system whereby the poetry comes in 2-line couplets, and the first line is always repeated. so that you've really taken that in before you hear the second line. And I think this, I mean, I know there's a huge amount of spoken poetry that goes on in Britain today. And I think it's written to be spoken, it's created to be spoken. So it comes out as a different kind of poem because people know it's going to be spoken and you've got to be able to take it in instantaneously. But I think some of the poetry that was written when people didn't imagine it was going to be spoken poetry is poetry that it's quite hard to take in over the air. What do you think?
It can be, but also the origins of poetry were verbal. So in a way, we've come full circle.
We have, but there was an intervening period where it was written.
Yeah,
written to,
that's right.
To be read.
It was it was for the page. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, one of the things that we do, and I learnt this from having poetry at the Readers' Retreat. The second year, we had Menna Elfyn, who is also a very, very fine international Welsh poet. And she always used to read her poems twice. So although at festivals, we would only present a poem once from each poet, at all my other poetry events, every poem is read twice. And sometimes people will say, could I hear that one again?
Yes.
Because we've learned that you do need time to take it in. Yeah. And we actually did a poetry breakfast just this morning, and Paul Henry was our guest poet this morning, and he said that every time you hear a poem, you hear something different because you will always miss something.
Well, and it's because of the nature of poetry, because it is very condensed writing. You know, it's not discursive writing. It is condensed thoughts, condensed,
right.
Carefully chosen words, and so on. So it really does repay hearing again, I'm sure.
Absolutely. I mean, you only have to miss one word, and you might have lost the whole sense of that stanza or even the whole poem. Yeah.
You've mentioned poetry breakfasts, and although I'd love people to hear more about the festival, and we'll come back to that. I think just say something about poetry breakfasts now, so that we don't run out of time.
All right.
It's a nice concept of poetry breakfast, and I think a lot of people probably have never encountered it before. So tell us what it is.
It's a very lovely thing. And again, it was one of those things that came quite organically. We were doing lots of poetry events by now at the bookshop. You know, we had the festival, we had things happening in between. But people had asked me for a gathering where ordinary people could read published poetry to each other. So not necessarily to have poets in, but just to share our favourite poems together. The only time I could do it was before the shop opened, which is why I called it a poetry breakfast. The local cafe served us they opened especially early for us. They served us with coffees and croissants. And the pattern became that we would read for 20 minutes, read aloud to each other for 20 minutes, 20-minute coffee and croissant break, and then another 20 minutes of poetry.
And just to clarify, these are not their own poems. It's not people reading what they have written. It's people reading poems they like. Yes.
It's published poetry on a given theme, and I would always choose the theme. There are places in Shropshire where you could turn up and read your own work to other people, but I didn't ever want to do that. I'm not a critic. I'm not a teacher. I didn't want to be in a position of saying whether somebody's work was good or not. So it had to be published poetry. And it is such a simple concept, but do you know what? It was absolutely magical. So we started off in Much Wenlock. We then grew to another bookshop near to where I live here. The Poetry Pharmacy opened in Bishop's Castle, very famous now poetry bookshop. We went there. We went to a meditation center, so it was spreading. And these groups were on top of my everyday work in the bookshop. But then we're probably going to head this way anyway. The bookshop had to close.
Okay, we need to take a minute to tell us why the bookshop had to close.
Yes, I will. I'd mentioned Amazon and the financial collapse. We came through that. We were fine. I mean, things changed a little bit. But in 2016, the year that you came to Much Wenlock, my mother became very ill, and I ended up taking almost a year out of work to look after her. I couldn't bear not to. It was a tough year, but I was really, really glad that I was able to do that for my mum.
Sure.
And I knew that my bookshop was being very well looked after by my staff. I had 3 staff then who worked incredibly hard, and they kept the shop going for me. But I wasn't there, or I wasn't there enough. And that does have an impact on a business when, you know, I was kind of seen as I am Wenlock Books, you know, so sales did drop off and it got a bit tricky. But I came back, I had as I said, most of that year out of the shop. My mum died in the September. I started going back to work, I think in the October. I knew that I had to have a break first. But I also, October to December is the busiest time in the bookshop. And my staff had already done all the hard work of ordering in the Christmas stock and so on. And I didn't want to just muscle in and tread on their toes. So I still kept quite a low-key presence in the shop. We had Christmas, it was a successful Christmas. I came back in January, absolutely raring to go. And they had had time to realize that, you know, I was coming back and I was just going to be back how I always was. And in January, I was so excited to be back in my bookshop. I'd missed it terribly while I wasn't there all the time. I always loved it passionately. In the February, I was diagnosed with cancer of the throat. And I spent the rest of that year, again, out of that shop, being incredibly poorly. My partner, Hilary, at the same time, was diagnosed with a brain tumor. My treatment started in March and ended in June, although I then still had a huge recovery program after that. I couldn't eat, I was tube fed because nothing would go down my throat. And in the July, Hilary was called for her brain tumor operation. So it was a very, very tough year. And in all this time, my staff struggled and struggled and struggled to keep the shop going, but it wasn't the same. Customers were drifting away. It was so easy for people to get books on Amazon. By the time I came back to the bookshop, and when I first came back, having been through such a traumatic experience, I felt vulnerable, I felt anxious, I didn't want to talk to people. Actually, even talking was still quite painful a year on. So I wasn't the same either. And I'd only been back in the shop for a few months when I realized this isn't working. I don't have the money to pay my bills. I'm having to put money into it to keep it going. And I just had to take a very swift decision. I had about 6 weeks to close the shop. And I described the next 4 weeks, once my customers knew what was, obviously I needed to tell my staff and, you know, people connected to the shop first. Once people knew they were coming into the shop, people would cry, people would say, is there nothing we can do? It was too late for all of that. And I described that period in my life as going through a 4-week-long operation without anesthetic. It was awful. I had also planned to do a 1-day poetry festival. That's another thing to tell you. The poetry festival it was easily a whole other job on top of the bookshop job. Sure. And I knew after my mum dying that I couldn't do both anymore. So I'd stepped away from the poetry festival, but still loved poetry and still loved to share it with people. And we had scheduled a new event called Poetry in the Barn, which was due to happen the week after the shop closed. Of course, I didn't know when I planned it that that would be the timing. And at first I thought, oh my goodness, this is going to be horrible. I'm going to be closing the shop one Sunday and then the very next Sunday having a poetry festival. But do you know what? It was the best thing that could have happened, because we came together, 60 of us, in a barn at a local bookshop, local to where I live, sharing poetry. Gillian Clark was there, Paul Henry was there, Pauline Pryor-Pitt was there, Carol Caffrey was there. You know, all these people who I loved and who loved me were there to share poetry, and everybody in the audience was a friend of mine. And I say that they were a friend because they were customers of the bookshop. And oh, I'm going to get upset again. but all my customers were friends. I made no differentiation between customer and friend. And there they all were at this wonderful poetry event.
Well, I think there's
So-
several. I'm going to give you a break so that you can deal with your choked up feelings. But it does seem to me that it's pretty miraculous that you're, I have a friend who's had throat cancer, and I know how long it takes to recover from it. The idea that you're sitting there chatting away eloquently for an hour without any problem at all, it's wonderful what medical science can do. It's wonderful what one spirit of healing can do. So first of all, congratulations on coming through all of that. That's really wonderful.
Thank you.
But secondly,
and my partner's fine too. She's learning Gaelic in the other room as we speak. So she recovered well too.
So it is, but what's also wonderful is having described the love affair that you have with book selling and with the shop. It's almost like hearing about the end of it. Obviously it was very traumatic, but it's almost like one would expect that to be sad ending, and it's actually not sad ending, because so much of what you started in the bookshop is going on. So now
Yes.
we need to go to that. Tell us about the Poetry Breakfast's new incarnation.
Yes, absolutely. Well, of course, COVID then happened, very soon after I'd finished the bookshop, closed the bookshop. And what I had done once the shop closed was to develop the reading groups, the readers' retreats. We were scheduled to do another tour of Venice. There were so many things going on, and then COVID hit. But again, I didn't want to just leave it all, and for me at this time, poetry was one of the life-saving things, because there is so much in poetry that can just elevate your daily life. And so I started doing a poetry breakfast online where I would invite people, again on a theme, to send in their favorite poems, and I would do a blog about it. And so we started doing that. It was going very, very well. And eventually I realized, you know what? I do need to be doing this on Zoom. I mean, at first I just thought, how can you do this not in person? It was such a people thing, and the coffee and the croissants and the sitting around the tables together. But at Christmas, I did my first poetry reading on Zoom. We did a Christmas special, and it was beautiful, and it worked very, very well. And that kind of gave me the confidence to think, just do it, be brave. So we had our first one on Zoom a month ago, and we did all get the same feeling of having been transported, of being elevated, of something magical having happened. Today we had our second one. Pauline was here, Paul Henry was here, Carol Caffrey was here. We had 15 different readers. We had 50 people in the room as it is. And we shared a selection of beautiful, beautiful poems on the theme of what will survive of us is love. And that felt just such a beautiful theme to work with. So I'm still doing the blogs for people who can't do Zoom or don't want to do Zoom, but I'm now adding to them by taking some of the poems from the blog and actually reading them aloud with people. And do you know what? After we've done it, it almost feels as though we really were together. So that's the next thing.
And we're almost running out of time. It's quite extraordinary because I feel we've only just started, Anna. There's so many more things we could be chatting about. There are many highlights in Anna's story with the bookshop, such as being nominated as the Independent Bookshop Seller of the Year. That was 2006, wasn't it? I mean, a real accolade, that, when you consider how many wonderful bookshops there are dotted around the country. And Anna was invited to be a judge of the Costa Book Prize, of the Poetry Prize. So she's been widely recognized for the work that she did so personally in a small town. It's just been wonderful. But before we see if there are, I'm sure there are people with questions, but before we go over to that, just tell us about joining the Poetry Breakfast, because now that it's on Zoom, it is open to anybody, is it?
It is.
Do you not want to be overwhelmed? Is it an open invitation?
It's an open invitation. Yes, anybody's welcome to come. It's, yeah, I'm very, very happy to share it. And all you need to do is to go to the website, which is wenlockbooks.co.uk, and you can find everything there about how to join us.
Well, that's wonderful. And Natalie, if you're there, you'd maybe like to come back and help us negotiate the questions that are coming. I think there are various comments on the chat, but I'm not just sure how many of them are questions and how much are. Oh, somebody's saying, Natalie, is it possible to get a copy of this interview? I'm sure we'd all love that. Anna, have you considered working with Hive? Do you know about Hive, Anna?
No, no.
Okay, so hive.co.uk, we'll have to go and have a look at them soon online and find out what it is. Somebody's saying, lovely to see Marion. I bought your book, A Language in Common. Well, that's so very nice to hear. Any questions for Anna? Oh, yes, lots more. I've got to just go up again. No, I think those are more people saying hello to each other. All right, we'll move back then to, we've got a few minutes more for Anna. Anna, I think it would be lovely for people to hear a little bit more about what happened in the festival, in the poetry festival, because it was my first poetry festival, because I'm not a poet, and I was completely bowled over, and I don't know whether the scale of things that you undertook was similar to other poetry festivals, or whether that was something that was unique to Wenlock as well. The number of different things going on.
Yeah, I think the Poetry Festival was unique to Wenlock because it was very much situated within the town. Although, having said that, Ledbury very much takes place in and around the town as well. I think what happened for us was that people in Shropshire were hungry for this kind of event. You know, if we wanted culture at a certain level, we would have to go to Birmingham, we would have to go to London, we would have to go to Stratford. And we did that in our droves, in droves rather, not in our droves, we did it in droves. But this was bringing international and nationally acclaimed poets to much Wenlock, this little town, population of about 3,500 people, medieval town, single lane high street, you know, beautiful old church, timbered.
Oh, you're frozen. I think you're frozen, Anna. I don't know if anybody else can still hear Anna, but to me she's frozen.
I can't hear Anna, but I can hear you. I think
okay. I think
it seems like Anna did say that she completely lost her internet just before we started, so I don't know if she's lost it. Oh no, I can see you.
Anna, you're moving again. We missed if you were still talking, Anna, we missed the last bits.
Okay.
You seem to freeze.
It was just to say that it was really all down to Carol Ann Duffy, because she came in as our founding patron. She years and years of hard slog getting ourselves established.
I think as a participant rather than an organizer, I'd say it wasn't just down to Carol Ann Duffy and to the big names that you brought. I remember vividly on the first evening of the Poetry Festival, there was this lineup of really well-known poets whom I'd never heard of, because I don't read that much contemporary poetry. So they were well-known officially, but not well-known to me, and maybe not well-known to other people who were there. And then there were a couple of local poets, and I was riveted by the local poets. That's where I met Carol Caffrey from her reading. So I think what you did was give a platform to local poets who were saying things which were really so wonderful to listen to.
Absolutely. It was always very, very important to me that the local poets were given a place where they could perform and read as well. So it was always the balance. But it was bringing in the big names, I think, that gave us weight, you know, that got us Arts Council grants and that sort of thing. But yes, the local community of poets was hugely important to me. Yeah.
And most, I mean, I then subsequently got to know quite a number of them, and they all said what a huge encouragement your activities in Wenlock had been to people who were quietly writing poetry but were isolated, and that by bringing together people to enjoy it, you'd actually given them more confidence to get together.
I keep losing you. I'm not hearing you properly. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I think I'm losing connection.
I'm
so sorry.
Well, I think we're coming up to 7 anyway. I think we'd probably better not risk our luck too much. We'll just say thank you very much, Anna. It's been a really lovely session.
Thank you.
And thank you for so generously sharing everything that you've told us about.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.
Great pleasure. Natalie, I think it's over to you. I think we're coming to an end.
Okay, thank you both very much. I'll end the talk there for you then. There are some further questions that came up in the chat, but maybe I can send them to Anna and send them out in an email or
that
something.
Would be lovely, and I'd like to see them too. Didn't have time to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you everybody for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you again in a month's time.
Thank you both very much. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.